afternoon. I'm Leo Pera, the Executive Director for the Cohen Commission. I want to welcome you to our news conference this afternoon. We'll hear a few words from Commissioner Cohen, and then we'll accept a few questions from the media. Without further ado, Commissioner Cohen.
Well, first of all, let me thank you all very much for attending today over this lunch hour and into the afternoon. As you all know, in November of 2009, I was appointed as Commissioner to inquire into the decline of Fraser River sockeye salmon. The 2009 sockeye return was the worst since the 1940s, and it was the third consecutive year without a commercial fishery. The sockeye fishery had been in a steady and profound decline since the early 1990s. What had caused this historic decline, and what does the future hold for this iconic species? These were but a few of the many issues and questions that were sought answers. During the inquiry, I have gained a deep respect for and appreciation of Fraser River sockeye, their challenging life cycle and the perils they face. As well, I have learned that by any measure, the management of the Fraser River sockeye fishery is a very complex and presents many difficult challenges. You have received a fact sheet, I believe, that indicates the scope of the inquiry's work and the range of complex issues that were examined. There were nearly 600,000 documents reviewed by the Commission, nearly 900 public submissions, 53 individuals, groups, and organizations represented during the inquiry process, 138 days of hearings with nearly 180 witnesses and more than 2,000 exhibits. My 3-volume report released today examines in detail the Fraser River sockeye fishery and the causes of the decline, and sets out my recommendations for improving the future sustainability of the fishery. I commend to you a reading of the 3 volumes for a detailed account of the Fraser River sockeye story. The 3 volumes contains a detailed account of the evidence I heard surrounding the life cycle of sockeye, the science of sockeye survival, and the management of the sockeye mixed stock fishery. I want to just briefly comment on some parts of my report, the causes of the decline, aspects of management of the sockeye fishery, and recent legislative amendments which may have an impact on these findings and recommendations. The 2009 return of Fraser River sockeye, as I mentioned, was the worst in half a century. Despite a pre-season forecast of approximately 11 million, only 1.3 million fish actually returned to the Fraser River. To understand this poor return, we need to go back to 2007, when 2-year-old smolts that would return to the Fraser as adults in 2009 were swimming north to the Gulf of Alaska. In 2007, there were well-documented irregular ocean conditions in Queen Charlotte Sound, and possibly also in the Strait of Georgia, including low surface salinity, extreme wind conditions, high sea surface temperatures, and a delay in the spring plankton bloom. Scientists do not know with certainty the level of sockeye mortality that occurred in these nearshore areas, but based on the evidence I heard, the conditions in these areas signaled the poor return of sockeye to the Fraser River in 2009. In 2010, we experienced a return of 29 million Fraser River sockeye, the largest return in a century. Several witnesses cited evidence of significantly more favorable marine conditions for juvenile sockeye in 2008, including better food production due in part, it is suggested, to a volcanic eruption in Alaska. those more favorable conditions may provide a partial explanation for the larger return. I note that in 2011, about 5 million Fraser River sockeye returned, while in 2012, a smaller return led to a closure yet again of the commercial fishery and a curtailment of the Aboriginal food, social, and ceremonial fishery. Given this recent volatility in Fraser River sockeye returns, it is difficult for me to discern a trend, let alone make pronouncements on whether the long-term decline is in fact over. Going back to the long-term decline, some, I suspect, hoped that our investigation would find, quotes, the smoking gun, a single cause that explained the 2-decade decline in productivity. That notion is appealing, but improbable. The Commission's 15 technical research reports and the many expert witnesses who testified before me made it clear that Fraser River sockeye experience multiple stressors on their health and their habitats. These stressors can cause death at various stages of sockeye life cycle. While I'm satisfied that researchers have a fairly good understanding of the mechanisms by which these stressors may affect Fraser River sockeye, what is less understood is the actual impact that these stressors have on them or their habitat. For example, some contaminants found in the Fraser River can adversely affect sockeye reproduction, but the extent to which they actually do remains to be discovered. Similarly, interactions between enhanced salmon from hatcheries and wild Fraser River sockeye in the marine environment can lead to competition for food and increased predation on wild juvenile salmon. However, whether there could be a long-term substantial reduction in production because of these interactions is less clear amongst the scientific community. Stressors can also act cumulatively, but little is known, for example, about the combined effect of contaminants, disease, and warming waters on the health of sockeye salmon. Volume 2 of my report reviews each life stage of Fraser River sockeye and includes a detailed analysis of the stressors. Based on the evidence I heard, few, if any, of these stressors can be taken off the table, as there is a risk that some of them, alone or in combination, may have contributed to the long-term decline of Fraser River sockeye. However, to date, data and knowledge gaps and lack of research have prevented scientists from identifying specific cause-effect relationships. A significant piece of evidence emerged from one technical report that stressors that are specific to Fraser River sockeye do not tell the whole story. One team of researchers examined 64 sockeye populations between Washington State and Alaska. They found similar decreases in productivity across these different populations since the early 1990s. That similarity suggests that large-scale factors may be playing a role in the decline of Fraser River sockeye. Therefore, I concluded that stressors specific to the Fraser River, as well as region-wide influences, may both have contributed to the long-term decline of sockeye. Regrettably, that's as far as the evidence takes me. For that reason, I recommended in Volume 3 several focused scientific research projects. This research should yield much needed information about the abundance, health, condition, and rates of mortality of Fraser River sockeye during their freshwater and marine life stages, and about the impact of contaminants and other stressors upon them. What about the future? In my view, unless significant remedial measures are introduced soon, the stressors that are currently believed to affect sockeye negatively will continue to do so. Perhaps most troubling is the impact of climate change. I heard that by the end of this century, sea surface temperatures in North Pacific are expected to increase by between 2 and 4 degrees Celsius, and there will be a doubling of atmospheric carbon dioxide. Fraser River water temperatures have increased by more than 2 degrees Celsius in the past 60 years, and may warm a further 2 degrees in the next century. 13 of the past 20 summers have been the warmest on record. One researcher testified that he was hard-pressed to think of a greater threat to sockeye than climate change. Let me be somewhat blunt about the implications of climate change on Fraser River sockeye. To use that well-worn phrase, warming water is the elephant in the room that we cannot ignore. On this important topic, I have made recommendations designed to address action around and research about warming waters. As well, I have recommended that we should look to the Government of Canada for domestic action and for Canadian support and encouragement of international initiatives that will reduce the impact of warming waters on Fraser River sockeye. Let me say a brief few things about the management of the fishery. Many of my findings and recommendations are interrelated, and in my view, need to be acted on without delay, even in the face of financial constraints and shrinking resources. Chief among my recommendations is the full implementation of the wild salmon policy. When DFO introduced this policy in 2005, a policy that promotes biodiversity and embraces ecosystem-based management, the minister stated that it significantly transformed the management and conservation of Pacific wild salmon. Successive ministers have publicly committed DFO to its full implementation. I was repeatedly told by DFO witnesses that the wild salmon policy is Canada's expression of the precautionary principle applied to Pacific salmon, and of DFO's strong commitment to its implementation. However, I was disappointed to discover that 7 years later, little progress has been made in full implementation of this policy. There's no full implementation plan. DFO has not performed a comprehensive costing exercise, and Ottawa has not set aside dedicated funds annually for its full implementation. Moreover, no specific individual within DFO is charged with responsibility for the implementation of this critically important policy. If the pace of implementation continues as at present, I have little confidence that the wild salmon policy will be fully implemented in the foreseeable future. If Canadians cannot count on the DFO to champion this transformative policy, then the Government of Canada must step forward and ensure that implementation happens without further delay. Thus, my recommendations call for a detailed implementation plan, segregated implementation funding, and the appointment of a new Associate Regional Director General in charge of the full implementation of this policy. I have similar concerns expressed in the report about DFO's failure to complete full implementation of its 1986 habitat policy, a key national policy. It complements the wild salmon policy as its ultimate goal is maintaining and restoring healthy fish populations through the restoration of damaged habitats and the development of new habitat. One of its guiding principles is no net loss of productive fish habitat. However, I heard evidence that after 25 years, DFO has not yet undertaken to complete this policy's full implementation and is in fact aiming to develop some new policy around this topic. In my view, DFO does not need a new habitat policy. Rather, it needs to complete implementation of the 1986 policy, including retention of the no net loss principle. Let me turn to another topic, and that is the regulation of salmon farms. The controversy that surrounded salmon farms when my inquiry began continues. I really want to comment on two aspects, but my report has a very detailed discussion of this topic. I want to talk about the role of DFO in promoting salmon farming and the risks that salmon farms pose to wild stocks. Given DFO's paramount regulatory objective to conserve wild fish, it faces a challenge in relation to net pen salmon farming along the BC coast. DFO's current role in relation to salmon farming is broader than the protection of wild stocks. It extends to promotion of the salmon farming industry and farm salmon as a product. In my respectful view, when DFO has simultaneous mandates to conserve wild stocks and promote the salmon farming industry, there are circumstances in which it may find itself in a conflict of interest because of divided loyalties for the reasons I set out in detail in my report. Thus, I recommended in my report that promotion of salmon farming should be transferred to a different part of the executive branch. Turning to the issues surrounding the risks that salmon farms may pose to wild fish, I have reached several findings and conclusions in my report. Briefly, they are as follows. First, Fraser River sockeye face some likelihood of harm from diseases and pathogens on salmon farms, but based on the evidence before me, I cannot quantify the likelihood of harm. In the absence of further research, scientists are left with plausible hypotheses and mechanisms whereby salmon farms may be causing disease in wild fish. Secondly, if such harm does in fact occur, the harm posed to Fraser River sockeye is of a serious or irreversible nature. I accept the evidence that a devastating disease could sweep through a wild population, killing large numbers of wild fish without scientists being aware of it. Third, I'm satisfied from everything I heard in the evidence, including public submissions and presentations at public forums, that British Columbians will not tolerate more than a minimal risk of serious harm to Fraser River sockeye from salmon farms. Fourth, I was not able to determine from the evidence whether current measures such as sighting criteria and fish health management plans ensure that the risk of serious harm from disease and pathogen transfer is a minimal one. Thus, I found that there are several steps that DFO can and should take to address this potential serious harm to wild sockeye stocks. First, let me say a word about the sighting of salmon farms. Currently, salmon farms are permitted in the narrow passages along the smolt outmigration route, particularly through the Discovery Islands, where the migrating wild smolts come into close contact with salmon farms. I heard evidence that this close contact increases the potential for the transmission of disease to wild stocks. I have recommended that DFO revise its sighting criteria to account for Fraser River sockeye migration routes and for the most up-to-date knowledge about the risks associated with farms. I found that if existing salmon farms do not comply with revised sighting criteria, they should be promptly removed or relocated. In short, DFO should seek to approve only the best sites to avoid negative impact on wild stocks rather than the best sites to produce farm salmon. DFO's first priority must be the health of the wild stocks. Second, DFO needs to take steps to minimize the scientific uncertainty about salmon farms. I accept the evidence that scientists need to continue to collect regulatory fish health data until 2020 before they can use it to confidently identify or rule out relationships between salmon farms and wild stocks. In addition to collecting regulatory data, DFO needs to research the effects of diseases and pathogens from salmon farms on wild sockeye. As well, little is known about the cumulative effects on sockeye of having multiple salmon farms sighted on their migration route. In recommendation 68 of my report, I identify the specific types of research that DFO should undertake. Third, according to the precautionary principle to which Canada and DFO are fully committed, mitigation measures should not be delayed in the absence of scientific certainty. In my view, salmon farms should not be permitted to operate unless it is clear that they pose no more than a minimal risk to Fraser River sockeye salmon. For these reasons, I recommended that first, production at salmon farms in the Discovery Islands be immediately capped at current levels. Second, on September 30, 2020, in consideration of research recommended in my report, the Minister of Fisheries and Oceans prohibit net pen salmon farms in the Discovery Islands unless the Minister is satisfied that such farms pose at most a minimal risk of serious harm to the health of Fraser River sockeye. And third, if at any time between now and September 2020, the results of any research cause the Minister to determine that salmon farms in the Discovery Islands pose more than a minimal risk to Fraser River sockeye, the Minister prohibit their operation immediately. I have a couple of final comments respecting management of the sockeye fishery. First, with respect to enforcement, I accept the evidence of witnesses who said that conservation is best served by proactively preventing fish from being taken illegally from our waters. When it comes to prioritizing enforcement expenditures, there's no substitute for having enforcement personnel on the ground, in the air, and on the water. I recommend that DFO should, at a minimum, fund its enforcement activities to ensure the same level of enforcement that was achieved in response to the Williams 2004 post-season review. Second, while I have been critical of DFO today and in my report for its failure, for example, to complete an implementation of its key habitat and wild salmon policies, many frontline DFO employees in the Pacific region who testified impressed me with their frankness and their commitment to and passion for Fraser River Sockeye. In my view, they have done a credible job in very, very challenging circumstances. Lastly, I just want to turn briefly to recent significant amendments to environmental and fishery legislation. Earlier this year, Parliament enacted Bill C-38, what has become known as the Budget Omnibus Bill. This bill received royal assent on June 29, 2012. In Volume 3 and in Volume 1 as well, I make notes about this particular bill. I summarized it in Volume 3. I summarized Bill 38's revisions to the Fisheries Act and the environmental assessment legislation that are relevant to this inquiry. As I state there, my analysis of the amendments is of necessity tentative, as the true import of many will only be known when regulations are drafted and published. Having said that, I find troubling the thrust of some of the amendments. Over the past 3 years, many experts from within and outside DFO have almost without exception emphasized the importance of protecting fish habitat, promoting biodiversity, and adopting ecosystem-based management practices. DFO's seminal 1986 habitat policy and its 2005 wild salmon policy promote these values. I agree with the principles expressed by these experts and outlined in the policies. However, the recent amendments appear to be taking DFO in a different direction with respect to the focus of the Fishery Act, particularly with respect to protecting fish habitat. Only time will tell what impact these amendments will have on fish health generally and on the sustainability of Fraser River Sockeye in particular. Thank you for your patience. I just have a couple of things to say in closing. First, I respectfully urge the Government of Canada to properly resource the Department of Fisheries and Oceans so that DFO can effectively implement the recommendations set out in my report. Second, in implementing the recommendations, DFO, as the manager of the fishery, needs to assume a strong leadership role and effectively pursue its collaborative and cooperative dealings with First Nations, stakeholders, and other parties in the management of a sustainable Fraser River Sockeye fishery. The strong themes that emerge from the evidence is that DFO Pacific Region must be adequately resourced to fulfill its important mandates under the Wild Salmon Policy and the 1986 Habitat Policy, and that input from First Nations and stakeholders, which has played and will continue to play a pivotal role in bringing about a positive outcome for the future survival and abundance of Fraser River Sockeye, particularly in the integrated strategic planning governance of the fishery envisioned by the Wild Salmon Policy. Thank you for your patience.
We'll get on to the questions. We have Christine on the left and Sarah on my right, who have mics to circulate to the media. When you are given the mic to raise your question, please announce your name as well as your media organization. And please use the mic because we do have a need to the interpretation booth. We also have a conference call connection into this room, and hopefully we'll be able to connect to some of the media who may wish to ask questions at that time. So at this point, over here, Sarah, and we'll start with you. Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Mi Jung Lee, and I'm with CTV. Commissioner Cohen, you talked about a minimal risk to wild stocks from fish farms. How do you define what a minimal risk is, and who should make that definition?
That's a good question, Ms. Lee. Thank you very much. I haven't specifically defined the word minimum. I have set out in my report a series of recommendations around research that needs to be done to get a handle on this very same controversy that you've spoken about. And in due course, when we see what that research tells us, I think at that time, determination will be made about what is minimal in the context of the knowledge that's brought forward through that research. We need to have that information so that the public can assess and be satisfied that the word minimal is in fact a real term in connection with the protection of the wild stocks.
Hello, Marcella Bernardo from CKNW Radio here in Vancouver. Just to ask you, you made it very clear that you believe the government has been too complacent when it comes to actually implementing policies that have been put in place in the past. What confidence do you have that any of the recommendations you've made today are going to be implemented?
Thank you for that question. I have set out 75 recommendations, and as you heard a few moments ago, I urge the government to implement the recommendations. I have no control over whether the government will in fact implement them. But as you can see here today from those who have assembled, and from what I said earlier about the numbers who have attended our public forums and our hearings, there's a deep passion and commitment to the sockeye in this province, and I think those factors will resonate with those who have to consider what attention should be paid to these recommendations.
Christine?
David Ball from Indian Country Today and Windspeaker.
Sir?
So your recommendation focuses only on the Discovery Islands. Now First Nations have called for a much wider ban on fish farms. There's some lawsuits in progress right now, for instance. So the two questions, or the two parts, are why did you have such a narrow precautionary principle applied? And secondly, how would you, what would your recommendations be larger around Aboriginal communities?
I think you'll see from my report, and that's why I said it's difficult for me to contain in brief comments what is a very complex topic. I did hear evidence about the risks associated with the transmission of disease from fish farms to wild stocks, particularly in those areas where there's close proximity between the outmigration and the existence of those farms. And so I have addressed what can be done to research the concerns that were raised by scientists around this particular connection where fish are swimming by these farms. I've also suggested and recommended a revised set of sighting criteria that takes into account migration of sockeye. And that particular set of revised sighting criteria will apply to all farms in the province, not just those in the Discovery Islands. So we have an opportunity here to do some focused research in an area where scientists have identified that there may be a concern, to get the knowledge base we need, the information we need, so the public can know for certain, or at least as certain as we can be with science, how safe it is to have farms located in that particular part of the province.
The Canadian Press. I was hoping you could elaborate a bit on the recent changes that were made to the Fisheries Act and what specifically you're concerned about with regards to your recommendations.
Yes, thank you very much. As I said earlier, the wild salmon policy is a very important policy according to the evidence before me. It addresses biodiversity, it addresses the introduction of ecosystem-based values, it addresses integrated planning procedures, it addresses conservation units. It is a very broad-based and important policy for wild stocks. My concern is that the focus of the amendments to the Fisheries Act will be focused more on fisheries than on habitat. And I think I heard time and time again from First Nations witnesses, from non-First Nation witnesses, from scientists, that the priority ought to be on health of wild fish, and you can't have healthy wild fish unless you have healthy habitat. Any move away from a focus and attention to habitat could be very damaging to the health of the wild stocks.
Hello, Chief Bob Chamberlain, Kwekwasutinu Kwakwatmis First Nation, Broughton Archipelago, Vice President, Union of East Indian Chiefs. Your report surely focuses on the sockeye, but I'm quite curious, in your opinion, would those potential impacts and the problems around sighting, would that apply to all salmonoid, or are you just commenting solely on the sockeye?
I am, at the moment, as you know, sir, this was an inquiry into Fraser River sockeye, so the evidence that was brought before me was specific to Fraser River sockeye, but I would expect, sir, that research that's done and sighting criteria that are revised would take into account wild stocks. But I cannot, of course, go beyond the scope of my mandate and the evidence I heard.
Just a reminder, this is a conference for the media, so I'm taking questions from the media. Is there any other media members who wish to raise a question? Yes, one at the back there, Sarah? Oh, Christine will get it.
Thank you.
Linda Aylesworth, Global BC News. You mentioned that the promotion of salmon farms puts the DFO in conflict of interest and that it should be moved to another branch of government. Why should the government be involved in promoting a private venture like aquaculture anyway?
As you'll note from my report, I did not venture into the issue of what the government of Canada should or should not do with regard to promoting industry. My concern and the concern and the issue before me was the question of the government's responsibility, that's say DFO's responsibility, to have this wearing two hats in a sense, protecting wild stocks while at the same time promoting farm salmon and the areas of responsibility they have around that, and it's set out in my report as to what those areas of responsibility are. And in my view, it is of concern when their priority is to conserve wild stocks while at the same time they may be promoting an industry that's having an impact on wild stocks. So that's the specific concern I had with that issue, but I certainly don't delve into what the government of Canada should do or not do with respect to promoting industry.
Do we have any more questions from the media? We have someone on the line?
Just one more live one.
Okay. Can that be put through, please, the one on conference line?
We have a question from Quinton Dodd. Please go ahead.
Good morning, sir. Or good afternoon. Quinton Dodd from Aquaculture North America magazine. Before I state my statement or ask my question, I should say to you that I've had extreme difficulty in hearing what you were saying, and that there was a great deal of comment from the operators of the line which overrode many of your comments, and I'm going to be asking for some further consideration in view of that. Could you please assist me in telling me how much of this problem that we've had with the returns of the sockeye salmon on the Fraser are, in your opinion, due to difficulties in achieving good levels of success with the hatchery program on Cultus Lake?
Thank you very much. I did hear you, and I can say that I regret that you didn't hear everything that I said earlier, but I can tell you that what I said is taken from my report, and that my report, if it's not already it's online, you can access it online. So I apologize to you if you couldn't hear what was going on here.
I could hear some of it, sir.
Okay. I just wanted to mention to you, I think the easiest way to answer your question is to refer you to the Cultus Lake case study, which is, I believe, Chapter 11 of Volume 1 of my report. And there you'll see a very detailed analysis around the history of the Cultus Lake sockeye and its implications for the wild salmon policy and other aspects of the fishery.
Okay, thank you.
Another question here? Yes?
Damien Gillis of the Common Sense Canadian Online Journal. There was a lot of controversy that came to light during the proceedings, particularly the second time around when it was reopened for the virus research, this groundbreaking research. A lot of controversy about chain of custody issues, questions from the Canadian Food Inspection Agency and both levels of government as to the veracity or the credibility of this research, while some of the top labs in the world designated to do that research are coming forward with these results. So how do you ensure going forward that that research you alluded to is done properly?
I can say that in the report you'll find a case study again on the ISAV evidence that was placed before me and a thorough discussion of that evidence. And again, I have set out in my report specific research, focused research to address that kind of issue.
Any further questions? Okay, I think that's fine. I want to thank you all for coming out, and I want to thank Commissioner Cohen for answering the questions. Thank you very much for coming out. It was very well done.
Ladies and gentlemen, the report is now live on our website. It took a while to get it uploaded for the big files.